Hello, welcome to USAWatchdog.com. We have back with us once again Karl Denninger of market-ticker.org. Karl, you've been on fire with your website lately. Welcome to USA Watchdog.
Oh, thank you very much.
Well, I want to start out with the Chicago Purchasing Managers report that just came out. And they said it's dipping down to a 3.5-year low. Is this going to be a trend? Is it not? But the economy looks weak to me. We are not in this recovery that they've been chanting endlessly for the last 4 years. I don't think this is going to turn back up. What do you think? Is the economy finally starting to once again roll over, even in the face of all this money printing by the Fed?
Oh, sure. But, I don't normally write on the Chicago Purchasing Managers Index. And the reason is that it's a fairly narrow index, although it's trumpeted as this big deal. It captures far too much of the auto industry and little industrial sectors and far too little of the broader economy. I tend to look at Empire, the Richmond, and the Philly Fed indices. Those are the three big ones. Dallas, by the way, the Dallas Fed Index was terrible a couple of days ago as well. And yet I don't look at that one generally either, or Kansas City for the same reason, because they tend to be very narrow. Dallas, of course, is very energy specific because it's Texas. All right. So, but when you look at these indices in the context of the last 3 or 4 months, what you see is a deteriorating picture. And these indices are very good predictors of what the broader economy is doing from a standpoint of the measurements that you will see in the formal press 3 to 6 months out. And they're what economists like to call high frequency indicators because they pick up the changes first. And what we've seen is deteriorating employment, deteriorating final demand, deteriorating basically everything. And so you have a soft economy, you have no pricing power, and now you're seeing the wages and hours drop, although employment counts are not yet dropping precipitously. So we're seeing the leading edge of a great deal of softness. And what this means is that the Federal Reserve's money printing games have run out of gas, that the temporary lift that you get in asset prices from this is now not being reflected into the broader economy. People starting to recognize that and saying, well, hey, guess what? My checkbook's empty. It doesn't really matter what the Fed's doing. I don't have any money to spend. And at the end of the day, that must ultimately flow through to corporate bottom lines and top lines. You're seeing the same thing in the earnings reports this quarter, which I had predicted was going to start to show up. It is top-line misses that come first. Corporations will squeeze employees and squeeze providers and producers and their vendors to the maximum extent to try to maintain profit margins. But ultimately, if you are not paying vendors on time, they stop selling to you. And so, and not only that, you bankrupt the guy that's in front of you in the production chain, and then he lays people off. Now, what do the consumers, where do they get the money to buy the final products if they don't have a job?
And this is all coming, against a backdrop of a burgeoning Obamacare rolling out. I mean, they told us you're going to be able to keep your medical provider. Well, not so sure that's going to happen in most cases. In a lot of cases, it's going to be cheaper. No, it's not going to be cheaper. And that it was going to provide insurance for everybody. Well, a lot of people are having their hours cut to 29 hours. And this is a real common thing happening that, you have a 40-hour-a-week job, just got cut by 11 hours, just got cut by more than 25%. So by 2014, when this thing really starts rolling out, isn't that going to kill an already weak economy? Isn't the Fed going to have to even print more money to compensate for that?
Well, they can't print more money to compensate for that because they can't compensate for it. The common chestnut is that the Fed can compensate for fiscal stupidity and government mistakes and errors. It's false. The problem with Fed money printing or quantitative easing, as they like to call it, is that everyone believes that there is such a thing as a free lunch. There is not. When you do that and you hand money to people in the form of food stamps and other entitlement programs, the purchasing power comes out of their pocket as fast as the free cash from the government goes in. So the net change to the person who gets those benefits is zero, but the net drain on the economy as a whole is enormous, because if I am a businessman and I'm considering starting a business or expanding my headcount, I look at this and I say, how can I do this when I don't know what the tax and regulatory environment is going to be? Or even worse, I know it's going to be much higher. So now I look at things, and as you said, the common thing now is we're going to cut hours back to 29 because this is how I avoid the Obamacare tax. Well, look, among young people, it's even worse. If you're a young person looking for a part-time or a full-time job now going into the summer, finding someone that will pay you to work for more than 20 hours is essentially impossible, because if I have someone go off sick, I can't schedule you for another 10, or you trip over that line. Young people under 18 typically under state laws can't work more than 40 hours a week. You can't work overtime. But what you're now seeing is that these kids are not being scheduled for more than 20 because of the possibility that someone will call in sick and they have to call somebody to cover, their place at the register or stocking or whatever they do. And they can't go over 29 hours because then they'll trigger that eligibility requirement. Even though these are people who would never want health insurance because on their parents' policy, it doesn't matter. Businesses are going to make decisions that are intelligent from their point of view, and this is what's happening.
Is Obamacare going to kill the economy in 2014? I can't see it not doing it. I mean, my premiums have gone up just for my own medical. I pay for my own medical insurance. They've gone up. They're probably going to go up again. They're saying that for some couples that they may double in some states. For some people, they may double. How is that not going to kill the economy in 2014 going into the midterm elections?
Well, it is going to kill the economy, but the problem is that Obamacare is yet another piece of government stupidity trying to fix a problem by attacking the side instead of attacking where the issue lies. The medical cost escalation that has gone on in this country, which is entirely fueled by government, could not happen without government's full involvement, is an outrage. In any other line of work, it would be a felony. Every one of the people involved in this would be in prison. If I did this when I ran my internet company, what these companies do, I would be in prison. And the fact of the matter is that monopolies or any attempt to monopolize or restrain trade is a violation of the Sherman and the Clayton Acts. Okay, this is not a matter of maybe it shouldn't apply here. Well, guess what? The insurance industry and the medical industry lobbied for and got exemptions from these laws. Then they use those exemptions to shove them up our backside. And this has been going on for 30 years. So we have a situation in this country where drugs in this country cost tens of thousands of dollars that cost hundreds of dollars in other nations. We cannot buy them in those other nations and bring them back across the border because that's a crime. And yet, hey, this is supposedly the market has this escalation of 8-9% a year. That's absolute nonsense. It's the same garbage that people were saying when houses were going up 10% of the year. You saw the book, Why the Housing Boom Will Not Bust, right? Well, look, costs of things in the general sense cannot rise faster than wages because eventually you will outstrip the ability of people to pay for them. This is basic arithmetic. Yet the cost of medical care has gone up at 9% a year from 1980 to today, just within the federal government. And if you look at it within the private economy, it's going up just as fast. So if you shift more of the private expense into the government, all you do is bankrupt the government faster. How does this solve a problem?
Going into to 2014, you see any bright spots for the economy, or is the economy just going to trail down right on into 2014 when they start really rolling out Obamacare in earnest?
Well, I don't see the bright spots. What I see here is flows coming into the United States because we are the hooker with crabs and everybody else has AIDS, okay, especially over in Europe. And so what you have is a massive amount of flow into here. You also have enormous currency debasement going on in Japan right now. So you have Japanese funds. If you look at what's happened in the market over the last couple of months, you will see that the S&P 500 and the broad market indices have an almost exact correlation on a day-to-day basis with the dollar-yen cross. Why is that happening? Well, it's very simple. People in Japan are seeing enormous destruction of purchasing power, and they're trying to get their assets out of the country in a way to avoid that. Where do they go? They go here because the dollar's been strengthening against that. So this is exactly the same situation, but driven by a different dynamic that happened in 06 and 07. If you remember in 07, we had this big yen carry trade. And when it blew up, it was a big contributor to the crash. Now you have these flows coming out of Japan. The problem is what Abe is doing over there cannot work for the same reason that debasement doesn't work in the United States. Remember, Japan has no oil. So all of their energy, with the exception of nuclear power, which of course they've turned all of that off after Fukushima, right? All of that has to be imported, but the oil is in the price of every single product you buy. So what happens to the Japanese consumer and their purchasing power as the cost of all these imports go up? Okay, how is it possible for what the Japanese central bank is doing to actually work and lift their economy? Can they lift asset prices? Sure, for a while, just like Ben Bernanke can lift the price of the S&P 500 for a while. All right. Is there a long-term macroeconomic stability process that comes out of this? Oh, absolutely not. So what we are doing is sowing the seeds of the next crash. And, the challenge is always when. The answer is I don't know any more than anybody else does, but that it is a certainty that when you have trillions of dollars of flows that are unsupported by real value, that they will revert back to the mean in reverse. That's a truism. That's going to happen. It's just a question of what's going to set it off.
Last question. If we do have another systemic crash, you're talking about bail-ins in Europe. There's talk about bail-ins in the United States. That people are going to lose their money. Do you think people will lose? I mean, Mark Farber, I can't tell you all the people that are worried, to Jim Rogers, about losing their money and their assets, at least some of them. Is that going to happen? Are people going to lose their money and assets in banks here in the United States?
It already happened in the United States. Does anybody remember IndyMac? At IndyMac, remember, anyone who was over the 100,000 limit, which this was before they raised it to 250, lost their assets. Okay? Now, IndyMac is an especially poignant example. And the reason is IndyMac was backdating customer deposits to misstate their asset and capital position, make their books look better than they really were. They were doing this with the full knowledge and complicity of the Office of Thrift Supervision, which is our government's primary regulator for those institutions. The OTS knew that the bank was doing this. They did nothing about it. The bank failed, and it was closed with a shortfall of assets against liabilities, which was either entirely existent because of this backdating or was larger than it would otherwise have been. So the losses that the people took that were uninsured occurred in whole or part because of deliberate malfeasance on the part of government regulators. Not an accident, not an oversight, a deliberate act, which if you or I did it would land us in federal prison. Intentionally falsifying financial statements is bank fraud. Why is nobody in jail? Yes, there will be losses. Yes, the government will be not only involved in looking the other way, they will be intentionally complicit in those losses. And yes, again, as things stand today, nobody will go to jail.
Karl Denninger, market-ticker.org. Thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
Thank you.